Welcome, conversing listeners. What is the credibility of the faith in a time like this? The Rethinking Church Initiative is launching a new podcast called Credible Witness.
I'm Nikki Toyamasito, and this is Credible Witness, a collection of stories and wisdom from faithful people wrestling with and bearing witness to the credibility of Christian life today. Each episode is an invitation to listen generously and courageously to one person, navigating social tension and moral complexity, negotiating doubts, struggles, and fears, overcoming obstacles and pursuing justice, and living out the convictions of their faith. And every voice reminds us that the church is called to be a credible witness to Christ, a living reality of hope, justice, truth, and love.
It's a beautifully rendered collection of stories that reward a courageous and generous listening. So please check out our show notes for links to the Credible Witness podcast feed, as well as crediblewitness.us. I'm hoping that you'll subscribe today, and I believe you'll be deeply encouraged by the series of episodes to come. Thank you for listening courageously with me, and may God bless this new effort.
Conversing is produced and distributed in partnership with Comet Magazine and Fuller Seminary. I'm Mark Labberton. Welcome to Conversing. It's a special joy today to welcome Dr. Daniel Zoughbie as our guest on Conversing. Dr. Zoughbie, Daniel, is an entrepreneur, a complex systems scientist, a diplomatic historian, and an expert on presidential decision-making. His most recent book, Kicking the Hornet's Nest, U.S. Foreign Policy in the Middle East from Truman to Trump, will be the book that we're going to be discussing. It's fitting that a person with his credentials and background should write such a book. He's the Associate Project Scientist at UCSF and UC Berkeley Center for Global Health Delivery, Diplomacy, and Economics in the Division of Health Policy and Management at the School of Public Health. Zoughbie is the principal investigator in Berkeley's Middle East and North Africa Diplomacy, Development, and Defense Initiative, a faculty affiliate at Berkeley's Institute of International Studies, and a faculty affiliate at the New England Complex Systems Institute in Cambridge. Daniel, welcome to Conversing. It's such a joy to have you.
It's really great to be here with you, Mark. I appreciate it.
You know, we met one another when you were an undergraduate at the University of California, Berkeley, and I loved hearing the story of your background, which is in part a Middle Eastern background. It's a background that in a certain way set up some of the terms of your interest and curiosity and your engagement with Middle Eastern issues. And the book that we're obviously going to be discussing, Kicking the Hornet's Nest, is a book that is absolutely about that. So give listeners a bit of a window into your background, some of the early things that shaped and formed your own awareness and potentially even identification with the Middle East.
Well, I think that's a really important question because in many ways, this book is about the view from on high. It's the view of those in power. And my own interest in the Middle East started with a trip to the region. I was a small child and sort of frankly horrified by what I was seeing. And, when I came to the University of California, Berkeley, people were very upset about what's going on in the Middle East. There were protests all over the place, and the Iraq War was happening, the second Iraq War, 9/11 had happened. And, it was said of Eleanor Roosevelt that it's better to light a candle than curse the darkness. And so I wanted to do something. I became interested for a variety of reasons in the topic of metabolic disease, type 2 diabetes in particular. And I saw this as something that people weren't really paying attention to. It's one of the greatest killers in the region. And it's a disease that is relatively easily preventable and manageable. And so I came up with something called the microclinic concept, which was really just studying the way Middle Eastern societies function. People, are naturally helping one another. They're naturally eating their meals together, entertaining each other together. And I just saw how this could be leveraged either for kind of poor health, right? Eating unhealthy foods, sedentary lifestyle, so on, or that social network could be viewed as a tremendous social capital and leveraged for good, for spreading health and making it contagious.
Right. And so what unfolded? I want to hear more about that.
So this sort of started as a student project, and I did a little pilot project and saw that, actually good behaviors are viral in a way. They take on sort of a contagious quality. And to make a long story short, this resulted in several scientific studies, including randomized trials. And we worked with the governments of Jordan and then scaled to other places in the world. We worked with the United Nations to scale the model throughout the West Bank, Gaza, Lebanon, and Jordan. And we even ended up taking the model here to the United States in Appalachia, Kentucky, where in many ways the conditions mirror what we see in the developing world. And, the consistent observation was that good health behaviors, just like bad health behaviors, just like violence, can be contagious and spread through social networks.
Well, it's an amazing thing to have done all of this work when you were still an undergraduate at Cal, which is partly, I think, why you received the Chancellor Award when you graduated from Cal. And it's an expression of who you are, as well as your ingenuity and entrepreneurship. It's also an expression, I think, of what would surely have unfolded through all of this, which was a greater and greater awareness of some of the granular details of what was really happening on the ground in different parts of the Middle East. When you came to Cal, were you expecting to study these fields, or did you have something else in mind?
No, I sort of came to Cal with an open mind and an interest in kind of urban studies, city planning, and really what I would call an openness to an interdisciplinary approach to education. And, in thinking about cities and urban sociology, I just became sort of fascinated with the concept of social networks. And I actually visited the Middle East, and again, just visiting people in their homes and seeing the way that the neighbors come over for food, and they take care of each other's children. In some cases, because in the West Bank, this is basically a war zone. So people split their medicine. They share their blood pressure cuffs, their glucose monitors.
Right.
And so this kind of microclinic model really emerged just from anthropological observation. And so I continued that as I pursued my graduate studies and did social anthropology and later on political science, international relations, and became interested in international security. I just became increasingly convinced that as we think about social problems, first of all, we need to think across disciplinary boundaries. Medical problems are not sort of biological problems, they're also sociological problems.
Yes.
And the second thing is that, as we think about sort of the Middle East in particular and the security crisis that we presently see in the region today, we really need to understand not only the view from above, why decision makers make consequential decisions, but also why those who are sort of at the very bottom, as it were, make the decisions they make, and just how consequential those decisions can be. I mean, if you think about October 7th, if you think about 9/11, we're talking about small groups of people who are changing the world with their decisions. And we need to understand more why they are making decisions that result in these sorts of crises, but not just that, to understand how they can be prevented.
Maybe one other question about your background that I think is really relevant to this. I understand that part of how you're described professionally is that you're a complex systems expert, really. And part of that expertise has to do with looking at exactly the inner workings of this multiple dimensional disciplinary kind of approach to understanding human behavior at lots of levels, but in this case, really related to presidential leadership, which we'll come to in a minute. But say a bit more about what that expertise involves.
Well, I think the way that I think about a complex system, it's a system where you have many different inputs, but what you get on the other end is not necessarily reducible to those, individual inputs that go into it. And so just talking about global health and diabetes prevention and behavior change using social networks, I mean, if we ask ourselves the question, why does somebody get type 2 diabetes? There's not really a simple answer for that, right? Because we know, of course, that there is a genetic component, but 9 out of 10 cases of type 2 diabetes can be prevented with lifestyle and behavior change. And so you have to look at this really complex picture of how people live their lives on a regular basis. What foods do they eat? Who do they eat those foods with? Who influences the way that they eat or don't eat certain foods? What are the macroeconomic and microeconomic forces that kind of flow into those decisions? How do people move? What are the city planning sort of components around them? Do they have sidewalks?
Yes.
Do they not? And so on. So you can go and create all these different variables and to think about them as potentially being more powerful or less powerful in terms of explaining sort of why an individual engages in certain behavior and why they might modify it. Taking that sort of to the level of international politics, international relations, and thinking about why nations do what they do, again, we have a fairly complex system that we're talking about. We have all the nations of the world. We have all these sort of factors that we know about and many that we don't know about. We have individual personalities, decision makers, presidents. We have, in democratic countries like ours, we have, a Congress, we have a Supreme Court. And then we have all these sort of historical activities that sort of pile up upon one another, right? Truman's actions certainly impacted what happened after him with Eisenhower and with Kennedy and so on. And so we have sort of this cascade of complexity. And, in the book, I sort of point out that we almost have a new law here, which is that, complexity is always increasing in the universe. And, the role of diplomacy and development, as I see it in international relations, is to slow things down. It's to stop complexity, from advancing so that people have time to sort of cool their tempers and to solve major security crises.
Right. So what was the seminal idea or moment when you, having studied social anthropology and then having studied political science, eventually come to the place after other publishing successes to deciding to do this particular book? It's an audacious book in the sense that it's taking on the whole presidential history, really, of the United States presidents during the Israel period since 1948. So how did that emerge, and why did you feel like now is the moment for this book?
Well, in parallel to my work, research and sort of implementation science work in the Middle East, working on global health, I was simultaneously getting very interested in the view from above. Part of the reason was because I was meeting a lot of, decision makers. As I was leaving Berkeley, I met George Shultz and Tony Blair here in San Francisco. And then, in England, I was, coming across various people, and I was realizing, these aren't sort of abstract people on the television, but these are real human beings who are making decisions just like the people in a refugee camp in Jordan are making decisions.
Right.
And so I became sort of interested in this. I also became interested in sort of not just the general sociological reasons for why people make decisions, but in particular, some of the ideological and one might say theological reasons for making decisions. So I became interested in sort of, this topic of millenarianism and, the sort of belief that various scriptures, and this is found in different Abrahamic faiths, but in particular in the United States, we see this in sort of some right-wing branches of Christianity, but the idea that, a set of scriptures sort of provides the political blueprint for the future. And, Mark, I recall you and I had a conversation well over a decade ago, but you said something to me that stuck, and you brought to the table the concept of Gnosticism. The idea that there's some sort of secret knowledge that one can gain access to sort of transcend this bad world and, transcend it for another sort of better spiritual reality. And, I sort of see that there's a resurgence of that in the world. Again, not just in the United States, not just among American sort of right-wing Christians, but globally. And that it is a powerful force that is shaping to some degree some elements within this complex system of what I've called sort of American foreign policy in the Middle East in the post-World War II era. So that was one sort of strain. And then meeting people was another sort of reason. And then I guess the third reason was, here I am doing all this work, trying to improve the health of millions of people with many dedicated people, nurses, healthcare workers. And yet the decisions of a few groups of individuals in Washington or in Brussels or in New York could dramatically shape everything. And so that was sort of really interesting to me, to dig deeper and understand how that decision-making process happens.
Right. Well, it's a sweeping vision. And the thing that I found, there were many things about the book that I found tremendously impressive, but one of them was the fact that you would simply tackle 12 presidents. Just to talk about 12 presidents is to take on a very significant task, and one which I think you've done, from my point of view, not as a specialist in this area, obviously, but from my point of view, with a great deal of research and care in the people and the circumstances that you're describing in each presidential period. I'm wondering, was there a major hope of the book that if readers could understand the significance of each of these 12 presidents from 1948 until now, that there would be a certain kind of outcome or response or clarification that would be available to people as a result of the sum as well as the parts of what you're describing?
That's a really important question for me. And the essential message of the book is that from Truman to Trump, only one president, and that is Gerald Ford, surprisingly, the only unelected president, gets this right. And that is that we've been relying on defense and we've atrophied our diplomatic and our development capability. These three Ds, defense, diplomacy, development, are the three-legged stool of American security.
Right.
And we know how important diplomacy and development are. General George Marshall understood that after the First World War, the reason why we got Nazi Germany, the reason why we got Adolf Hitler in the first place was because the Allies punished the Germans too severely and salted their fields. And this sort of created the circumstances where anti-Semitism, racism, all sorts of sort of demagogues could emerge from that. And so he understood after World War II that things needed to be different this time. And the Marshall Plan really was an enlightened way of viewing the American self-interest. We will help the Europeans rebuild a destroyed civilization because it's in our own self-interest to do so. The same logic was applied to Japan, even to Turkey and Greece. They were given aid as well. But the rest of the Middle East region, what is today called the Levant, was sort of ignored. And the problems were exacerbated by the fact that America only really relied on defense, militarism, coups, covert and overt action to sort of, wage its Cold War against the Soviet Union. And what I show is consistently throughout this book that far better alternatives were on the table from Truman to Trump, and that Ford was really the only one who said, we are going to get, in this case, the Israelis and the Egyptians, we are going to basically force the Israelis to talk with the Egyptians. And what emerges is, Carter gets the credit for getting Camp David over the finish line, but we have the cornerstone of American security, and by the way, Israeli security in the region, which is peace between Israel and Egypt, based on land for peace. And what is needed today in this incredibly, incredibly dangerous security competition is the same sort of forward thinking. And we need not to increase the growth of complexity. We need to suspend it with development and diplomacy.
Right. So let's move to a discussion of Gerald Ford, because he does clearly pop out as the leading line of hope from your analysis. And I think that will catch many readers off guard, and I think it's an extremely important set of observations. So take us into that. What emerged that somehow he was able to respond to in a diplomatic way in which the other two Ds were less prominent?
Well, the first thing I think we have to realize is that the 1973 war did not need to happen in order to have peace. Many people are under the impression that we had to have the Yom Kippur War in order to have a peace treaty between Egypt and Israel. And in fact, had both parties been induced to sort of come to the table earlier, that war could have been averted. I should point out that war almost took on a nuclear dimension. And when I say almost took on a nuclear dimension, I mean a war that could have led us to a global nuclear apocalypse. Also, the 1967 war I show in the book, that was also preventable, and that could have also led to a global nuclear apocalypse. In fact, Robert McNamara said it was one of 3 of the most dangerous moments in recorded human history. So what happened was the Yom Kippur War had occurred, and Ford took over from Nixon after the whole Watergate scandal. But he kept on Henry Kissinger, who was also serving under Nixon. And I credit Ford with 2 things. The first thing is he got the Israelis to sort of engage in diplomacy with the Egyptians in a more serious way. But the second important thing that he did is he used the tremendous skills of Henry Kissinger and gave Henry Kissinger the ability to use his own talents and personal connections to achieve diplomatic goals. And so what happened is Ford wrote probably one of the most kind of serious letters in the history of U.S.-Israeli relations, basically saying, if you don't take negotiations with the Egyptians seriously, we're going to reconsider our relationship with your country. Nixon, did not do this. And Ford and Kissinger were able to get this done, in particular because Kissinger was, first of all, a descendant of, survivors of the Holocaust. He had a personal relationship with Rabin. And in fact, they played tennis together. And so the lesson here is that you don't have to be enemies with people to get them to do what is in their own self-interest. They saw that this was in the national interest, first and foremost, of the United States, but it was actually in the self-interest of the Israelis. And they pushed, and Ford in particular, pushed the Israelis and the Egyptians. The Egyptians were already wanting to have a diplomatic dialogue. And that sort of diplomacy laid the groundwork for Camp David and ultimately the peace treaty that occurred.
It's an amazing moment. And from a non-specialist point of view, what strikes me is that Ford coming into the presidency as abruptly as he did meant that he was not setting himself up as the person that was going to turn the ship in some really significant way. It suddenly is in his hands and he's trying to deal with what's in front of him, but he's not an escalationist. So by temperament, at least it's my assessment that that's true. And his instinct toward diplomacy may have come, and I'm asking this as a question, may have come out of a sense of both his strength in that moment because of the uniqueness of this moment, as well as the vulnerability of the moment. Is that a fair way of understanding that? Or do you think there's obviously more than those things, but does it include those things?
I think that's very well put. I mean, he came into the presidency as the country was deeply, deeply divided, and he saw himself as somebody who was in many ways trying to heal some of the deep divides and the mistrust among Americans. And, I think sort of being thrust into this moment, not sort of necessarily having, plans for, a great political dynasty or something like that.
Right.
All certainly, shaped his thinking. And I think as importantly, after the 1967 war and after the 1973 war, it became very clear that this Middle East conflict is a conflict that is extremely, extremely dangerous. And serious measures need to be taken to ratchet things down a bit. And so I think all those things sort of flowed into that set of decision making. And, I think we also shouldn't discount his personality. I mean, he decided that this is what we're going to do. Many of the other presidents that we see, including one who I wrote another book on, just sort of wavered back and forth indecisively.
Right.
And, I think it was Machiavelli who said, an irresolute prince is not a good thing in politics.
Right. And we've had, according to your analysis, a number of irresolute princes in the presidency. Right. So it is a very curious thing to me, because in a way it feels as though Ford was set up with both a greater urgency than perhaps ever before about how this must be settled diplomatically. And on the other hand, it felt like he was also simultaneously freer than some of the elected presidents were in this sense of their own legacy and dynasty. He was like the triage man in the moment, who had a temperament and capacity to say, we've got to get this settled and get it settled diplomatically, because war is going to be the end of us all.
Yeah. I think that's a great way to put it. And in some ways, we see, at least in terms of the international kind of security competition and the regional security competition, the recent war between the U.S., Israel, and Iran, I mean, this is another extremely dangerous moment where we're talking about, 60% enriched uranium that is now, unaccounted for. And so, what is needed now is some of that sort of forward wisdom and forward diplomacy.
Right. It also strikes me that in your analysis of the other 11 presidents, that you're very careful, I think, to try to diagnose the machinations in a compressed form. I mean, the text is a highly disciplined text. Your writing is fluid and it's very readable. So it's not at all difficult for a non-technical reader to read it and understand what it is you're describing. But it is a dense read because there's so much information and so many personalities that are involved. And what strikes me is that in that to and fro of the debate that you're laying out that goes on between various nations and especially key leaders, there tends to be so much more personality present. Whereas in the Ford case, it seems as though his personality was of the kind that he was not making himself the center of the story in some kind of way. Whereas the temptation, not just of U.S. presidential leaders, but of many of the other leaders of other governments and nations, have themselves thickly written into the narrative. And he did not have himself thickly written into the narrative.
Well, I think you've sort of hit the nail on the head, which is, sort of another theme of the book, that throughout, the last 8 decades, what we find is that pride, national pride, the pride of any one individual, is toxic. It's toxic to the individual, it's toxic to the nation, it's toxic to the world. We find in the works of philosophy and in the scriptures, the Old Testament, the New Testament, everybody is saying pride is not a good thing. Pride goeth before a fall. And I think just reading the history, you see how that's the case. And it's ultimately self-defeating for the nation when, we go around sort of teaching other people, how they should live their lives and using the military to do so. If we look at the Iraq War, the George W. Bush presidency, for example, we see that the whole idea of democracy promotion, the freedom agenda. I mean, first of all, it's in shambles right now, if you look at the region. But more importantly, I mean, we really have a lot of our own problems that we need to deal with in the United States right now concerning democracy and freedom and things of that sort. So, it's just time and again, you see that those who are accusing others of corruption find themselves embroiled in corrupt enterprises. Those who are accusing other nations of not being democratic often find themselves in crises in their own, democracies. And so that issue of national pride, I think, is something we have to think very, very deeply about as a nation. And we have to do something about that.
I found myself feeling very sobered by the analysis that you are offering, because Ford's being an outlier as he was suggests that out of 12 presidents, only one had the capacity to be free enough from themselves and free enough from their own power, perhaps, or reputation or legacy, or whatever the constellation of all of these various factors can be. And it makes me wonder if then we're in an era which seems to me potentially an anti-diplomatic era, where there's diplomatic formats that keep being exercised, but the fundamental instinct of a diplomacy that really wants to seek non-military, non-violent resolution to major crises seems like it's waning in the broad global narrative. I know there's many examples that that's not true, but there are plenty of examples that does seem to be true. And I just wondered if it takes another Ford to bring us to another place where there might be a diplomatic resolution in the Middle East.
I think that you're right, that today it seems that the personalities of any one individual are becoming increasingly important. And I don't know to what extent this is a derivative of a culture in which everything is about selfies, right? Myself. And we've come a long way from just going back to the Marshall Plan, this idea that there is something that is bigger than us, right? It's bigger than the United States. It's that another part of the world needs to be rebuilt. There was this horrific war, and that we need to think outside of ourselves. Now, I'm not deluded enough to think that the United States is a humanitarian organization, or that any nation that has ever existed is going to be sort of solely focused on the concerns and needs of other groups of people. But the genius of the Marshall Plan was that Marshall understood that there is sort of a place where the deepest needs of other people intersect with the capabilities that we as a country have, and that intersection actually is the optimal place for American security. And again, that is going outside of this idea that, we are the best and, we simply can enforce our way of life and propagate it around the world through force. It's about kind of understanding that people have needs, recognizing what their needs are, and seeing how we can help. In the conclusion of my book, I kind of reflected on the idea of what does a better way look like?
Yes.
And of course, one of the themes throughout is that we constantly ignored diplomacy. At the same time, we ignored ways in which the American government, but more importantly, the American people, could engage with this region more productively. I'll give you a few brief examples, or your listeners, some examples from the book. The American University of Beirut. This was the Syrian Protestant college. It was set up by, American Protestants who wanted to build better educational outcomes for people in the region. This is today one of the best universities in the world. It's certainly one of the best in the region, if not the best. And the people that have come out of this university are just remarkable people. And, despite the fact that the Lebanese people do not necessarily have a great view of America, this university is considered to be one of the crown jewels of Lebanon. And just thinking about how that could be replicated, I mean, imagine if all of this money that we've spent on military activities went into more American universities, more hospitals,
Right.
more secondary schools. I think we'd actually need to do a lot less in sort of the military arena, in terms of preventing attacks against the United States and Americans.
I'm just so taken with this question of what it takes to pursue diplomacy when militarism is always at hand, and when it's not only militarism, but nuclear power is always at hand. And for a number of reasons that you've given in the book, there are these moments that come extremely close to nuclear activity. And even this year, I was expecting to travel to Cairo during the week when it looked as though the bombing of Iran was fast approaching, and the Egyptian government was closing down all kinds of things and saying tourists shouldn't come and people shouldn't come even as visiting scholars, which is what I was doing. And then once the American bombing happened and there was no fundamentally significant response, and we probably missed the cache of all the chemicals that we were intending to blow up, which would have been theoretically at least its own nuclear bomb going off. All of that slid away. And in the doing of that, then the decision was, I'm not going to go to, we had to decide that week, and then the trip got put off. My point of telling that story is only that it felt like it was the moment when you most wanted to be there with people on the ground about what was really going on in those very, very vulnerable moments. And then also this sense that it was a cataclysm, that this could have been the war that really might be the end of all wars in at least in a prototype like way. So I guess I'm just curious, when we press toward this diplomatic alternative, the mettle that it takes in character and mind and moral categories and ethical thinking and care for the other and not just care for self, none of which I would say are very highly ranked in our current administration. What is the way through this in this current administration, and what do you think lies, you would hope, beyond it?
Well, I think the example you gave about Iran and how it, was an extremely dangerous moment. I think it's still actually a very dangerous moment, because
Yes.
The Israelis have made it clear that it is unacceptable for the Iranians to possess a nuclear weapon, and the Israelis have nuclear weapons, and the uranium, the 60% uranium, is currently not accounted for. I spoke with Leon Panetta, the former CIA director, and that was his view. So, the JCPOA, which was put in place, it was an imperfect diplomatic, achievement of the Obama administration. And, that was an achievement of diplomacy during that administration. Unfortunately, their kind of activity towards the other matters was not helpful. But that was sort of suspending the program, and it was working. And, the bombing of Iran really increased the complexity once more. You had all the materials, the 60% enriched uranium in one location, and the Iranians moved it. And so that's an example of where diplomacy was ripped up in favor of militarism. And we're in a worse situation. For all I know, the Iranians could be working in some lab to, cross the finish line and get one nuclear bomb. And by the way, you don't need a sophisticated delivery system. You can put it in a boat. You can put it in a helicopter. And there's a lot of Americans right across the street from Iran and the United Arab Emirates.
Right.
So, what is needed now is kind of learning from the lessons of history. What did George Marshall do? What did those who pursued diplomacy, what did Ford do? A diplomatic agreement needs to be hammered out. Once again, it's probably not going to be as good as what the JCPOA was doing, but something new needs to be done. And we have to talk to people we don't like as a country, and we have to induce them to, accept our proposals. We have to negotiate with them. And the Iranians, I think, understand that, they don't want to destroy their civilization either. The Israelis need to understand that, their future is at risk. The Iranians have capabilities to close, down Chinese shipping from the region and, all sorts of things. So
Right.
this is truly an international security crisis. And the only way around it is to really keep talking and to try and hammer out an agreement. And in particular, to use the superpowers, the Russians and the Chinese and the regional players like Pakistan and India to get the Iranians and the Israelis and the Americans to a point where they have a situation that everyone can live with. And that frankly is what's needed.
Well, what you're arguing for, I certainly support and hope is possible. What, Daniel, would you expect as this book, which is just newly out, what would you expect are some of the most controversial claims that you're making in the book?
I think the basic idea that when we're thinking about the Middle East, we shouldn't constantly be in this mindset of calling everything appeasement. We sort of take the Munich analogy and we sort of, when Gamal Abdel Nasser comes to power, by the way, with the help of the CIA, it's Munich all over again. He's Hitler on the Nile. Saddam Hussein is Hitler on the Euphrates, appeasement. Taking any sort of diplomatic approach is just dismissed as appeasement. You can't appease evil. That is sort of the argument that's made. And the whole point of the Munich analogy, in my view, is that what comes before that is really crucially important, which is what I've already said, that
Right.
we took the Allies punished the Germans too severely after World War I, and that is the reason why we got the Nazis and Adolf Hitler in the first place. And instead, we could think about, as a thought experiment, what would have happened if we had taken more of a George Marshall approach, more of a President Ford approach. What could have been done to prevent, a second world war, essentially? And I think if we think about that basic thesis is borne out by the facts. We see over the last 8 decades that we've just caused failure after failure for American foreign relations in the region.
When you think about the bigger picture of global power here, stepping back from the Middle East per se, and thinking about presidential power in this era, which is a power that seems to be driven principally by some of the worst sort of human instincts, like pure egotism and other things in the American landscape, then what it takes to imagine not pursuing appeasement feels like it's a virtually impossible thing. Are you just an ideologue or an idealist in this argument? Or do you feel like there are, and you've given examples of Marshall and Ford as examples, where people have different instincts, but in this realpolitik moment that we're in, what process of movement toward a non-appeasement approach could be taken that you would see as realistic?
Well, I would describe the view that I am proposing as being one of ethical realism. And, I would bring to the table Max Weber, a
Yes.
great sociologist, and he wrote this wonderful essay in which he contrasts what he calls the ethic of the gospel with the ethic of responsibility. And he, of course, points out that whereas individuals are supposed to live by, the highest moral principles of the gospel, to turn the other cheek and, do that sort of thing, the statesperson, he argues, is not able to do that because he has the responsibility on his shoulders. But he says something interesting in that essay. He says, there's a moment at which a truly great statesman can sort of say, here I stand, and I can do no other. And his point was that while the statesman has a certain responsibility to use force, to use deadly force to protect a country, there's still the possibility of breaking through that and to find a higher ethic. And that ethic is what I'm describing, where the nation doesn't abandon its national interests. It
Right.
finds itself concerned with a more enlightened sense of self-interest. Yes. The Marshall Plan, again, being a perfect example of that. We're helping other people, but we're helping ourselves.
Right. And so the current administration's plan for what should happen in Gaza feels to me like the opposite of the Marshall Plan in instincts. It's a development of land. It's a rebuilding of sorts. Whether it's for the sake of the people in Gaza and their long-term well-being is another set of questions.
The cessation of the war between Israel and Hamas is something that I am forced to say I welcome that. I'm not going to disagree with that.
Yes.
The proposal for Gaza is flawed in the sense that it will be doomed to failure unless there is, first of all, a real credible political horizon for the Palestinian people.
Right.
There has to be.
Yes.
Remember, this is a nationalist conflict. And nationalist conflicts they're not easy to solve.
Right.
And unless we understand the causal relationship between the violence and the desire for national self-determination, we're not going to eliminate the possibility of another October 7th and another terrible war. And so we need a credible political horizon that satisfies the legitimate self-determination aspirations of the Jewish people and the Palestinian people. And in my view, that can only be achieved through a partition of what was then mandatory Palestine and the establishment of two states side by side. And you can build skyscrapers in Gaza, you can build the Four Seasons in Gaza, and it's not going to work. You're just going to have another war until you address that core issue of nationalism.
Yes. Daniel, this conversation could quite literally go on for hours, and I look forward to that happening privately. But for today, I just want to say thank you for what you've shared, and at least toss you the ball for any final word that you might want to offer to our listeners.
Well, I think the final point that I would make is just, foreign policy making is not just something for secretaries of state and those in power. All of us in a democracy have a role to play, whether it's just sort of reading the newspaper and voting or, doing other things. And, the most important thing that I would highlight for your listeners is the importance of citizen diplomacy. Those people who built the American University of Beirut and the many other educational institutions, the Gaza Baptist Hospital, for example, these are people who have made a difference in the lives of countless individuals in the region. And these are individuals who can also help us to build the better world that we all seek.
Daniel, you're an inspiration to me and a challenge, because this citizenry that you're talking to includes me and includes all of our listeners. And it includes taking the world with the seriousness that it deserves. Even when we feel impotent to really do something, there's still a possible way of engaging. So thank you for that vocation, and thank you for all that you've provided us in this book. I look forward to further conversation.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Conversing is produced and distributed in partnership with Comment Magazine and Fuller Seminary. Peter Labberton is our engineer and editor. Evan Rosa is our producer. For more information about Comment Magazine, visit comment.org, where you can subscribe, read the current magazine issue, and browse their archive. Fuller Seminary is an evangelical, multi-denominational graduate institution committed to providing indispensable formational education for diverse Christian leaders everywhere. For information, visit fuller.edu. I'm your host, Mark Labberton. Thanks for listening with me.